welcome to the HealthBridge Association podcast. My name is Jia Shah, and in today's episode, we'll be talking about healthcare innovation, which is why we have our guest over here, Esther, who's from Novartis, which is a pharmaceutical MNC. So, Esther, why don't you tell us a bit about your role and an introduction on yourself?
Sure. Thanks, Gia, and thank you for having me today.
Thank you so much.
So, my name is Esther. I work for Novartis, like what Gia mentioned. It's a Swiss-based pharmaceutical company. I am in the innovative access role, which is essentially, in simplest terms, a role that ensures that the innovative treatments within Novartis get to the patients at the end of the day. Right? So we do a variety of activities
Right.
in order to make sure that at the end of the day, either a government or a private payer would be able to pay for the treatment that patients can access to.
Okay.
So that's essentially what we do.
Nice. So it's a very interesting role about making sure the treatments you develop actually reach the patients in the end.
Yeah, and it's quite unique in the pharma industry actually. This role doesn't really exist in many other industries. So this is a pretty unique role within the pharma industry.
That is quite good. I can see that it's very patient, like public focused, and you want to make sure there's a good effect on the public who receive the treatment.
Yeah, definitely, right? Because as part of the work that we do, we want to make sure that our products bring value to the healthcare system. And how do we demonstrate that it brings a good value to the healthcare system such that governments will be willing to pay for it? For example,
Yes.
right? So, for example, if we have oncology treatment, how can we prove that beyond just making sure that the patients can be cured, but what other effects it can have on the society, right? For example, because the patient is cured, they don't have to go back for follow-up visits. So the government saves money in that sense, or the patient doesn't need to get hospitalized. And therefore, there is savings to the healthcare system in general.
Yes.
So there are actually more value beyond just treating the patient, but also societal value. And that's what we try to prove, right, in our course of work in
Okay.
market access.
Yeah, that was very good to know. We haven't ever heard of this before. So could you share some things about like any breakthrough therapies or treatments that have been developed at Novartis or what's implemented currently?
Sure. So in Novartis, actually, we really focus on 5 key therapy areas. The first one is cardiovascular, which is basically treatments for the heart or the circulatory system. And then the next one is around immunology, which is basically diseases that impact or are caused by the immune system. The third area is neuroscience, which is diseases that affect the brain or the central nervous system. The fourth is cancer oncology, right, where actually you would see many people have family members or friends who are actually affected in this space. And the last one is around blood diseases. So these are the 5 key therapy areas that Novartis really focuses on, and that's where our greatest research and development efforts go into. Recently, we have quite a few new launches, right? And one of them was actually a treatment for a very rare blood disease, right? And that's something that, when we think about pharma, where our R&D funding go into, it's really to find the next treatment for that next unmet medical need, right? In the space
Yeah.
of rare diseases, it affects like 1 in 1 million people, right? If you think about it, let's say in the context of Singapore, where we have like close to 6 million
Yes.
people, which means that only 6 patients in a year actually can be impacted by this disease,
Right.
And very often, if you talk about major pharmas, they may not want to invest that research and development funding to just treat 6 patients only. And therefore, there's always very unmet medical need, right? Because obviously, a lot of research is targeted at major diseases that impact people around the world.
Yes.
So in Novartis, we actually really look into many of these rare diseases or diseases where we believe there's the highest unmet medical need or there are no suitable treatments at present.
Okay.
And then we bring these treatments to market.
So what disease is this, like the rare blood disease that the...
This is the name of the disease is paroxysmal nocturnal hemoglobinuria. I cannot even pronounce
Oh,
it
wow.
properly, right? It's a disease where essentially the red blood cells get broken down, right, in your blood system. So, and then it just gets passed out in your urine and causing a very dark colored urine.
Oh, okay.
And what happens to these patients is that they very often have to go for blood transfusions. They feel very tired. They cannot go on their regular day, right? You would imagine a patient who has this disease would say, oh, I cannot work
Oh yeah.
because I feel tired every single day. Or I cannot work because every two weeks I need to go to the hospital to do a blood transfusion. Or in the later stage, it could be that I cannot work anymore because I now have a kidney problem, right? I cannot go on my daily life. And it's a long-term complication of this disease. So these patients actually may look very well
Yeah.
because, once they get the blood transfusion, they look well again, but
Yeah.
their quality of life is severely impacted. And therefore, having a treatment that can
Yes.
actually help them would really ease the symptoms, help them have a better quality of life, enable them to potentially go back to work, right, in the workforce, because this disease tends to really affect patients earlier in their life, right,
Yeah.
as compared to some diseases that affect patients later in their life. So it actually impacts their productivity, their family
Yeah.
life, the ability to, even some patients we hear, oh, now they are thinking about, oh, maybe I can have a family, right? I can
Yeah.
have children, right? So it really has a profound impact on their lives.
That's great to hear. It's good to see that, like, everybody in the pharmaceutical industry, there's like still people and companies who focus on people who might not be served enough yet because of how rare the disease is. So for this like treatment, is it this is more of a drug, right? Or is it like a whole regime? Like you have this much dialysis and then this, like is it something like that?
Right. So I think when we look at any disease, we have to look at it holistically. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Of course, the drug is just one piece of the entire treatment. Right?
Yeah.
The treatment can be really from the day that you feel unwell, like what do you need to do to get diagnosed? What do you need to do to get referred to the right treating doctor?
Mm-hmm.
And then eventually, what treatment the doctor may decide to put you on. So in Novartis, especially when we look at disease areas, we don't just look at, okay, how can I make sure that the patient gets access to the treatment, but rather, how can I make sure that the patient across the entire journey from the day that they feel unwell to the time that they can get treatment, how can we ensure that we reduce barriers along the way?
Okay.
And that's part of our work in the access team, which is around healthcare system strengthening. Right?
Okay.
Because at the end of the day, if the patient cannot be diagnosed, right?
Mm-hmm.
If the patient cannot see a specialist that really looks at this disease, because rare disease, not every single doctor
Yeah.
is specializing in it.
Mm-hmm.
So if the patient cannot get to that final doctor, they will never be able to get the treatment.
Yeah.
So it doesn't matter if we have a treatment available on the market or not. The patient will not be able to even access it. So how can we make sure that, okay, there is a framework set up such a way that there's clear diagnosis, there is clear referral systems, that the physicians, they can get to the physicians on time, right? And they can eventually then get to the treatment that they need, be it whether it's a Novartis treatment or not. Right?
Okay.
So it's not just getting the treatment, but making sure that along the way we reduce barriers.
Okay.
For the
Yep.
patient.
Okay, that's good to know. So I've also like from our research, we found out that Novartis has different programs to bridge the gap between access to healthcare, like you just mentioned, in underserved areas or where there's like financial barriers, anything like that. So could you share any examples of programs you have implemented?
Sure, sure. So, like I mentioned earlier, when we think about access to treatment, it's not just the final piece of that medication getting into the hands of
Yes.
the patient, but rather the entire journey that the patient has to go through. In many of these underserved regions, right, if you think about it, the needs that they have is actually very different from countries where, like high-income countries
Yeah.
or middle-income countries, right? So if you think about a patient in sub-Saharan Africa,
Yeah.
their needs are very different from a patient in Singapore, for example. And that's where we actually start, right? First, looking very closely at what are the unmet medical needs in that country.
Okay.
So, for example, in Singapore, malaria is not an issue.
Yeah.
But in countries in Africa, malaria is still a huge problem, right? And people die from malaria every year. So what can we do, right, more, right? So actually from Novartis standpoint, what we have done is to invest in clinical trials for malaria, just
Okay.
for, this group of countries where it is still a significant concern. So that's where we start, right? Not just saying, okay, I do a clinical trial that is for all my, high income countries
Yeah.
where I know I can sell my medication, but really looking at what the need is. Start with the need, right? So that's where we start. And along the way, we have multiple programs. And in fact, we just announced this new program over the weekend,
Oh.
right? We signed a new agreement with the Max Foundation. And the Max Foundation is actually an NGO, right, that
Yeah.
serves a lot of these countries where they don't have easy access to healthcare. And we signed an agreement, like I mentioned earlier, for this rare disease.
Yeah.
What we call it PNH, right? Let's not go into the very long
The full
name.
name, yeah.
Right. So for this very rare blood disease PNH, we signed an agreement with Max Foundation. And we signed an agreement for 53 countries around the world, right? So it includes Sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, Asia Pacific, Latin America.
Yeah.
And really what we aim to do is not just to give away free medication for patients in these countries, but also, like I mentioned earlier, how can we build up the entire system around really making sure that patients get diagnosed, treated
Right.
in a consistent manner, right? That
Yeah.
they have access to the medications that they need. Because especially for a rare disease like PNH, even getting diagnosed is a very big problem.
True.
Because you could be a patient, you are basically looking at your urine, it's dark colored, let's say, right? And you're like, oh, there's something wrong with me, but I don't know what's wrong. And then you go to a primary care physician, and the primary care physician will say, oh, there seems to be something wrong, but I don't know what's wrong. Let's run a series of tests. And maybe the test will come back to say that, okay, you have blood in the urine, you have hemoglobin in the urine, but we don't know what's causing it. Then you need to be referred to another physician.
Yeah.
In order to finally get diagnosed, this patient actually needs to go for what we call a kidney biopsy, right? To actually look at the kidney right under the microscope. And that's where in many of these countries, they don't even have such a procedure, all right? Or it's not something that's routinely done. So even that is a barrier in itself, right?
Right.
So working with Max Foundation, we're trying to bridge the
Bridge
gap
that
to
gap.
this, right? How can we make sure that there are facilities like that? How can we make sure that we train the healthcare professionals in these countries to be able to conduct a renal biopsy, to read the results, and then to finally diagnose
Yeah.
it, right? So there are a lot of points along the way that we need to intervene. And at the end of the day, we also provide free treatment, right, for
Yeah.
patients, right, who are then finally diagnosed. So this was just announced on Saturday or last Friday, right? So something that I think it's another example, right, and a new program that we are adding on to actually our legacy of programs that we've had in Novartis. So
That's
something
quite-
very exciting.
Yeah, it's very exciting. It's good to see that as well. Since you mentioned clinical trials and how this is the whole process of making sure the whole system, like you're bridging the gaps and any barriers within the whole system of the patients getting access. How long would this usually take, like a time frame from the start when you think about, oh, there's this disease, think of the clinical trial, then think of how to implement it and all these programs?
Yeah, so I think if you just start broadly clinical trials, you have many stages, right?
Yeah.
First, you start with identifying whether this molecule may even work, right? So you go through the whole database of, okay, I have like 10,000 molecules in the database, right? And I say, okay, maybe this might work in this certain
Yes.
disease area, right? So I do some research on it, and that could take a few years, let's say.
Yeah.
Right after that, you say, okay, now that I think that it worked, I have to put it into animal studies, right? So first test in animals before you test in humans, right? So again, that might take some time, right, to test in animals. If it works, then you say, okay, let me bring it to the phase 1,
Okay.
right? And then if phase 1 works, which is again maybe 1 year or something, right? Then you say, okay, then let me bring it to phase 2. Because phase 2 is where you first test it in humans who are
Okay.
actually sick,
Okay.
right? So phase 1 is like healthy volunteers, right? So you are trying to
Okay.
understand how this
It
drug
affects
will affect the
the-
body, what are some of the things you need to be concerned about.
Yes.
And then in phase 2, you really want to test, does it actually work in patients who are actually sick, right? So you go into phase 2, but there's smaller numbers, just kind of like a proof of concept almost, right? And then it goes to when you pass phase 2, which takes another few years,
Yeah.
let's say, Then you go into phase 3.
Right.
And phase 3 could be very long or could be very short. It depends, right, on the type of treatment. So, for example, a treatment for a heart disease or cardiovascular disease, typically we need outcomes trial, right? So we need to show that the medicine is able to prevent um, major events for the future, right? And that usually takes a long time. It could be 5 years, 8 years,
you have
just to, in that phase 3 clinical trial.
Yeah.
And then once you're able to then get through phase 3, you then have to actually file in every country to the health authority to show that this medication, this new medication, has benefits that outweigh the risk of using it.
Yeah.
And that takes another, like, say, 1 year or 2 years for a review. And then after that, you can finally really bring the product to the market.
Wow.
So you can imagine it's a very, very, very long process. It takes maybe more than 10 years.
Definitely.
Right? Really to even get to the stage where you can eventually bring a product to the market. And that's why the patent of a lot of the molecules is 20 years.
Okay.
Right? From the day you discover it, you file a patent.
Yeah.
And then you have 20 years to actually bring it to market and commercialize it.
Okay.
So that's typically the cycle, right, of drug development and commercialization.
Thank you for sharing that with us. So it's very interesting to see that how long it takes, and even considering that there's still many motivated people like such as yourself who are like very engrossed and interested in engaging with this whole process. Like the scientists, for example, they must have spent 10 years like working on this one disease. So talking about careers, many students, right, they think the healthcare industry, what can they do? Like they can go into medicine or work at a hospital. But we can see how there's so many different like fields. There's pharmacy, there's biomedical engineering, there's so many different like fields. So any advice you have for students who don't necessarily want to become a doctor but are still interested in this whole healthcare landscape?
So I think there are many, many actually careers within healthcare, right? Of course, being doctor is one of them. Of course, you have your regular healthcare professionals like pharmacists, nurses, your physiotherapists, nutritionists. So you have that whole group there, not just being a doctor.
Yeah.
So there could be interest in. I myself, I'm a pharmacist by training, right? So I have a pharmacy degree, and eventually I was a pharmacist actually. I worked in a hospital. I worked in a retail setting. And eventually I decided that I want to work in the pharma industry. And within the pharma industry, there are also many roles, right? So like what you mentioned before, you have the scientists, right, who really look at research and development, and how they would really look for the next big thing, right, to help patients. And then, of course, you have all the people involved in the clinical trials, right? The clinical trial managers, all the people making sure that the clinical trial supply gets to the site. And then, of course, you have all the people involved in finance, for example. And you have the people in regulatory who are the ones that then submit the file to the health authorities to get it registered, right? And then you also have people like me who are in market access to make sure that when the treatment is on market, how can we bring it to the patient, right? That last bit.
Yeah.
And of course, you have all the marketing colleagues and sales colleagues, right, to then commercialize and sell the product, right? So there are actually many roles within the pharma industry. It's not, if you don't want to be a doctor, you could come to the pharma industry. There are many doctors as well in the company, right? Because we always need to have the clinical, or rather the impact on patient in mind, right? So if you're a healthcare professional like me, when I was working as a pharmacist, I see firsthand, right, how medications impact the lives of patients.
Yeah.
So for me, the purpose is it's very clear, right? So it's about, if you don't want to be a doctor, there are many paths available, right?
Yeah.
But I think importantly is you have to kind of stay flexible, right?
Right.
Because there are many paths available. You could be very agile, right? If you take like say a base science degree, right? If you want to enter the pharma industry, you could actually go between functions, right?
Okay. Yeah.
There isn't, unless you want to be a research scientist, then of course
That's a
probably need a
different
PhD
pathway.
in biochemistry or something, right? And that's different. Or if you say I want to do manufacturing, right, pharmaceutical manufacturing, then probably yes, you need a degree in engineering or biomedical engineering or something, right? which is very specific. But if you talk about the rest of the functions, it could be a little bit broader,
Yes.
right? You can just do a general science degree if you're keen, and then you can move
Yeah.
around the various functions within the company.
Yeah. See, I think we needed to hear that because to anybody watching, for students, like when they think going into science, first thing is always, oh, but I don't think I want to be a doctor. And then, like, the whole stress around, like, what we should do in the future. So it's very good that you said, like, talked about flexibility as well, about how one degree doesn't mean that you've determined what your whole life is going to be about. There's always, like, flexibility
Yeah.
around.
Yeah, I have pharmacy degree, right?
Yeah.
And then you would think, oh, you have a pharmacy degree, you must be a pharmacist. Yeah, sure, I was a pharmacist,
Yeah.
right? And I'm still happy to be a pharmacist. But with the training that I received in pharmacy, it helps you to think in a certain way. You
Yeah.
get a foundational understanding of diseases, of medicines, and that really helps in my daily work as well,
Yeah.
right? So and I know many people who are even doctors, but they're not doctors in
Yeah.
the company. They could be a doctor by training, but they are maybe commercializing the product. They could be
Okay.
actually in the marketing field.
Right,
So
yeah.
just stay flexible and agile. I
Okay.
think that's the best thing.
Yeah.
The degree is just a grounding.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. And now, just before we end, we'll just have a few quick questions.
Sure.
What skills do you believe are most essential for any students or anybody who wants to enter the pharma industry? Just like a few words. What skills?
What skills? I think there isn't any specific one just for the pharma industry, to be honest, right? The pharma industry, the only difference is that there is technical skills,
Yeah.
right, that you may want to acquire if you want to go in a technical area, right? But every other skill, it's actually applicable across all industries,
Yeah.
right? So the ability to think critically, right, think strategically, right? These are key skills, right,
Yeah.
in the pharma industry. The ability to adapt to change,
Yeah.
right? Because change is happening all the
All
time,
the
right?
time.
And
Yeah.
the pace of change is even faster than ever, right? And we are in the business of innovation.
Yeah.
Right? We have to keep thinking out of the box. We have to keep thinking differently, right? So the ability
Yes.
to actually adapt to change is really, really important.
That's good. Okay, thank you. And how would you describe the future of medicine in one sentence or word, given your line of work right now in innovation?
I think the future of medicine is going to be very much driven towards personalized medicine and precision medicine, right? So it's
Precision
about, everybody has a different genetic makeup,
Yeah.
and therefore you may react differently or you may have a different disease, right? So having a very personalized medicine for the future, I think that's something that we can expect to come.
Okay, thank you. And lastly, what is any personal like mantra or any personal quote that you just believe in that that's the basis of your work, that any personal thing that just drives you?
Yeah, for me, it's really about patience first, right? Anybody can work in the pharma, or you can work in any company. If you're
Yeah.
a finance professional, you can work in any company. But if you choose to work in the pharma company, it must be because you believe in a certain purpose.
Yeah.
Right? And for me, this is always patience, right? The work that I do have an impact on the patients at the end of the day, right? Helping them to have better lives or extending their life,
Yeah.
right? So I always keep that in mind, no matter what I do, right? So sometimes life gets to you and you're a bit tired or you get frustrated, but you think
Yeah.
about what I'm doing actually impacts patients out there, then you feel like, there's really meaning in the work that I do.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you so much for coming on our podcast, Esther. We learned a lot of new things. I'm sure like many students or anybody who's watching this didn't know this much in detail about healthcare innovation and how exactly it works. So thank you so much for coming on here and like sharing all this with us, as well as the amazing advice you gave for students as well. I think we all would really appreciate it. So thank you so much for coming.
No problem. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you.